Rain had been threatening Chicago all day, and by the time Olivia Bennet pushed through the staff exit of Lakeshore General, it had finally made good on the promise. She stood under the awning for a moment, peeling off her surgical cap, letting the cold air wash the smell of antiseptic and blood out of her lungs. 16 hours. A gunshot wound to the abdomen, a car wreck with a collapsed lung, and a 7-year-old with a ruptured appendix who was, last she checked, sitting up in recovery, asking for ice cream. It had been a good shift, in the way that ER shifts were good, which was to say no one had died on her table. She dug her keys out of her bag and started across the employee lot, her sneakers slapping against wet asphalt, her mind already 3 steps ahead. Home, shower, 4 hours of sleep before she had to be back for rounds. She didn't notice the van parked at the far end of the lot, engine running, headlights off. She didn't notice the man leaning against the lamppost who straightened up the moment she passed him. She noticed when a hand closed over her mouth. Training did what training does. Her body reacted before her mind caught up, elbow snapping back into a solid chest, foot stomping down on an instep. She heard a grunt, felt the hand falter, and then something cold and wet pressed over her nose, and the parking lot tilted sideways, streetlights smearing into long gold ribbons, and the last thing she registered before the world went black was being lifted off her feet, weightless, like falling without the fear that should have come with it. She woke to the smell of rust and standing water. Olivia's wrists were bound behind a wooden chair, the kind with the legs that wobbled, and her ankles were lashed to its frame with electrical cord. Her head throbbed with the particular ache of whatever chemical they'd used, and for several long seconds she simply existed in the dark, blinking against a single bare bulb that swung gently from a rafter 20 feet above her, throwing crooked shadows across corrugated metal walls. A warehouse. Somewhere near water, she could hear it, the slow slap of waves against a dock, the metallic groan of cranes she remembered from childhood trips to Navy Pier with her father. 3 men stood near a stack of shipping pallets, talking low. One of them, broad-shouldered with a shaved head and a scar that bisected his eyebrow, noticed she was awake and walked over, crouching so they were eye level. "Dr. Bennet," he said, like he was savouring the title. "Daughter of the United States Attorney's golden boy. You have no idea how valuable you are tonight." "My father will tear this city apart looking for me." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. The man, she would later learn his name was Frankie Dunlap, a capo who'd spent 8 years answering to a man he'd grown to hate, smiled like she'd told a joke he found mildly amusing. "That's the idea, sweetheart. Your father's going to tear this city apart, all right, just not the part he's expecting." He stood and walked back to the others, and Olivia caught fragments. Cross's signature, leave the ring, make sure the feds get the call before the cops do. Words that meant nothing to her yet, but would, in time, rearrange the entire architecture of her life. She didn't know the name Damien Cross. She would. What she understood, in the bone-deep way the body understands danger before the mind finishes processing it, was that she had been taken not because of who she was, but because of who her father was, and that whatever was happening here was bigger than a kidnapping. It was a message. She was being used as a sentence in someone else's argument. Punctuation in a war she'd never been told she was part of. Frankie crouched in front of her again, and this time he had a knife, turning it slowly so the bulb's light caught the blade. "Don't worry, Doc. You're not the target. You're the proof." Damien Cross kidnaps a federal prosecutor's daughter. That's the kind of thing that ends careers, ends lives. Tomorrow there's not going to be a Cross organisation left standing, and I'm going to be the one holding the keys. He said it almost gently, like he wanted her to understand the elegance of it. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because in about 10 minutes it won't matter what you know." He stood, nodded to the others. "Get the camera. We need proof of life before we send the message." Olivia's pulse climbed into her throat. She thought of her father's voice on the phone. "I'll be late, sweetheart, don't wait up." Said 1,000 times across a childhood spent waiting for a man who chased monsters for a living. She thought, absurdly, of the appendix patient in recovery, wondering who would check on her in the morning. She thought she might die in a warehouse that smelled like rust, 15 minutes from the hospital where she'd spent the last 6 years learning how to keep people alive. Outside, beyond the corrugated walls, headlights swept across broken windows. Once, twice. And the men by the pallets went still, weapons rising in practiced unison. "Someone's here," one of them said. Frankie's smile didn't waver, but something tightened behind his eyes. "It's fine. Nobody knows about this location. Nobody—" The warehouse door exploded inward. 40 minutes earlier, Damien Cross had been standing at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse on Lakeshore Drive, a glass of Macallan untouched in his hand, watching the storm roll in over the water and thinking, not for the first time, that the lake at night looked like something patient. Something waiting. He was 34 years old and had buried more men than most soldiers see in a career, most of them by his own order, a handful by his own hand. He had inherited an empire built from his father's blood and held together with everyone else's, and in the 10 years since Vincenzo Cross had been gunned down outside a Lincoln Park restaurant, Damien had not slept through a single night without dreaming of the purge that followed. 41 names. He still remembered all 41, the way some men remember scripture. His phone buzzed against the marble counter. Marco Falcone, his consigliere, the only man left alive who'd known him since he was a boy, following his father through the back rooms of Italian restaurants, learning to read a room before he learned long division. "Talk to me," Damien said. "We've got a problem." Marco's voice had the particular flatness of a man choosing his words around something he didn't want to say. "Frankie Dunlap and 6 of his crew went off-grid 2 hours ago. Took one of the cargo vans. Nobody authorised it." Damien set the glass down without drinking from it. "Dunlap doesn't move without orders. Whose orders is he taking?" A pause. "We pulled the van's last ping before the tracker died. It's near the old Sheridan Street docks. And Damien, there's something else. The surveillance feed from outside Lakeshore General. Frankie's crew was there 40 minutes ago. They took someone out of the staff lot." "Who?" "Olivia Bennett." For a moment Damien said nothing at all. The name moved through him like a current finding ground. Bennett. Richard Bennett. The United States Attorney who had spent a decade trying to put Damien's head on a federal pike, who had built his entire career, his entire identity around the singular mission of destroying the Cross organization because his brother had died in the crossfire of a war Damien's father started before Damien was old enough to understand what war meant. Tell me you're wrong, Damien said quietly. I'm not wrong. And Damien, think about what this looks like. Cross soldiers grab Bennett's daughter off hospital property on camera. By morning, the feds will have a kidnapping with your fingerprints all over it, whether you ordered it or not. This isn't a kidnapping. It's an indictment with a ribbon on it. Damien closed his eyes. He understood, in the space of 2 breaths, the entire shape of the trap. Someone inside his own organization had decided the easiest way to take the throne wasn't to challenge the king directly. It was to hand the king to his enemies, gift-wrapped, and let the federal government do the killing the old-fashioned way couldn't accomplish. Frankie didn't have the imagination for something this elegant. Someone above him did. Get me 4 men, not soldiers, the quiet ones. Cole, Reyes, the Marsh brothers. We move in 15 minutes. Damien, Marco's voice sharpened. If you go in person and this goes wrong, there's no story that saves you. You're the boss. You send soldiers. You don't. I am not sending soldiers to clean up a mess that gets me erased either way, Marco. Damien was already moving toward the bedroom, pulling a black jacket from the closet, checking the weight of the pistol he kept in the drawer beside his bed, the one with no serial number, no history, nothing that could be traced to a man who, on paper, owned 6 restaurants, 2 parking garages, and a stake in a downtown hotel. If Bennett's daughter dies tonight because my own people set this up, it doesn't matter whether I gave the order. The feds will say I did. My own organization will say I did, because that story keeps Dunlap's faction alive and me dead. The only way I survive this is if I'm the one who walks her out of that warehouse breathing. And if someone sees your face? Damien paused at the door, considering the question with the same cold precision he brought to every problem that had ever threatened him. Then they don't see Damien Cross, he said. They see Dean Carter, real estate investor. Wrong place, wrong time, good instincts. He'd used the identity before. Clean papers, a shell company, a man who existed exactly as much as he needed to, and not 1 inch more. Get Reyes to call it into the precinct the second we're clear. Concerned citizen who heard gunfire near the docks. I want a story already moving before anyone has time to ask questions. He hung up before Marco could argue further, because there was no argument that mattered more than the math in front of him. Somewhere across the city, in a warehouse that smelled like rust and lake water, a woman he had never met was about to die for a war that had started before either of them were born, and if he didn't move now, every single thing he had built and bled for in the last 10 years would collapse into the same grave that had swallowed his father. He did not yet know that the woman's face would haunt him long after the gunfire stopped. He only knew that he had spent a decade becoming a man capable of walking into that warehouse without hesitation, and that tonight, for the first time, he was glad of it. The door came off its hinges in a single concussive boom, and for half a second the warehouse held its breath. 6 armed men, frozen mid-turn, the bare bulbs swinging wildly from the force of displaced air, Olivia's heart slamming so hard against her ribs she thought it might be audible. Then the world became noise. Damien moved through the doorway, low and fast, 2 men flanking him, and the first shots came from Dunlap's crew, wild, panicked, the kind of shooting men do when they've been caught flat-footed. Damien's return fire was nothing like that. It was economical, precise. A man near the pallets went down before he'd finished raising his weapon. Another folded backward over a crate with a sound that made Olivia's surgeon's mind catalogue it clinically, even as her human mind screamed. Muzzle flashes lit the corrugated walls in strobing white, and the smell of cordite replaced the smell of rust. And somewhere in the chaos, Frankie Dunlap was shouting orders that nobody was following anymore, because there was no one left to follow them. A bullet sparked off the metal chair beside Olivia's, close enough that she felt the heat of it pass her cheek, and she did the only thing she could do, bound to a chair in the middle of a gunfight. She made herself as small as possible and prayed to a god she hadn't spoken to since medical school. Then a man was crouching in front of her, and for one terrible second she thought it was Frankie, come to finish what he'd started. But this man's hands were already working at the cord around her wrists, fast and certain, and when she looked up into his face, she found something she had not expected to find in the middle of a massacre. Focus, so absolute, it looked almost gentle. Dark eyes, a jaw set hard enough to crack stone, a thin line of blood at his temple from a graze he hadn't acknowledged. "Don't move," he said, low, and it wasn't a command so much as a vow. "I've got you." "Behind you!" she gasped, because Frankie had circled wide, gun rising, and the man in front of her didn't even turn around. He simply pivoted on his heel, fired once without seeming to aim, and Frankie Dunlap dropped where he stood, the knife he'd been turning in the bulb's light clattering uselessly across the concrete. The cord gave way. Olivia's hands came free, and she gasped at the sudden return of blood to numb fingers, and the man, Dean Carter, he would tell the police, though she didn't know that yet, pulled her up out of the chair so fast her knees buckled, and he caught her against his chest without breaking stride, one arm locked around her like the rest of the gunfire in the room was simply weather he intended to walk her through. "Cole, clear the east exit," he called, and one of his men peeled off toward the dockside doors. "Reyes, with me." "I can walk," Olivia managed, though her legs were not entirely convinced of that fact. "I know you can." His voice didn't change, didn't soften, but his arm around her did, fractionally, the way a man adjusts his grip on something he's decided matters. Doesn't mean you have to. They moved through the warehouse fast, past bodies Olivia made herself not look at too closely, out through a side door into the rain where a black SUV idled at the edge of the lot with its lights off. He got her into the back seat himself, crouching at the open door for one extra second longer than the situation required, checking her face, her wrists, the dilation of her eyes. Not a soldier's assessment, she would realize later, but a man checking the way you check something you can't afford to lose. "You're in shock," he said. "That's normal. You're safe now." "Who are you?" Her voice cracked on the question, adrenaline finally catching up with her, hands shaking violently in her lap. He hesitated, just barely, just long enough that she felt it more than saw it. "Dean Carter," he said. "I was in the area, heard shots." It was, she would understand much later, the first lie he ever told her, and also somehow the truest thing he said that night. Because he had been in the area, in the sense that he had built his entire existence around the principle of being wherever danger required him to be. "You saved my life. You're going to be fine." He said it like a fact he was personally responsible for guaranteeing, and then he straightened, closed the door, and said something to the driver in a tone too low for her to catch, and the SUV pulled out into the rain-slicked street. Olivia turned in her seat, looking back through the rear windshield at the warehouse receding behind them, lights now flashing blue and red as the first patrol cars arrived, and at the man standing in the downpour, watching the SUV go, not moving, not looking away, like he intended to memorize the back of her head through the glass. She did not know his name. She did not know that the man who had just killed 3 people to save her life was the single most wanted man in the Midwest, the one her father had spent 10 years trying to destroy. She knew only that something had shifted in her chest in the space of 4 bullets and one steady voice telling her she was safe, and that whatever it was, it did not feel like fear anymore. The hospital that received Olivia 3 hours later was not Lakeshore General. Protocol, the EMTs explained, given the circumstances, and given that her father had apparently mobilized half the Chicago field office the moment he'd gotten the call. She sat in a curtained bay at Northwestern Memorial in a gown that wasn't hers, an IV taped to the back of her hand, giving her statement to 2 detectives and a young FBI agent named Maria Chen, who took notes with the careful patience of someone building a case file, one fact at a time. "And the man who got you out," Agent Chen said, "you said his name was Dean Carter." "That's what he told me." Olivia's hands had finally stopped shaking, though the memory of the gunfire still made her flinch at sudden sounds. "He said he heard shots and went to check. He was already armed. I don't know if that means anything." "It means a great deal, actually." Chen exchanged a look with the older detective that Olivia couldn't read. "We have a Dean Carter on file. Real estate. Clean record, no priors, owns property up and down the North Shore." She didn't say what she was clearly thinking, which was that a real estate investor with no military background did not typically dispatch 3 armed kidnappers with the calm efficiency the responding officers had described from the scene. "We'll need him to come in and give a formal statement." "He saved my life," Olivia said, more sharply than she meant to. "Whoever he is." She didn't have to wait long to see him again. 20 minutes after the detectives left, the curtain around her bay shifted, and there he was, changed out of the rain-soaked jacket, a thin line of stitches above his temple where the bullet had grazed him, looking entirely too composed for a man who'd been in a firefight a few hours earlier. "You're supposed to be giving your statement downtown," she said. "I gave it." He stood at the foot of the bed, hands in his pockets, and something about the careful distance he kept felt deliberate, like a man testing how close was safe. "I wanted to see that you were all right before I went home." "I'm alive. The doctors say I got lucky. Nothing but bruised wrists and a concussion they're keeping me overnight to monitor." She studied him, the steadiness of him, the way he held himself, like a man who'd learned a long time ago that stillness was a kind of armor. "You didn't have to come back." "No," he agreed. "I didn't." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable so much as charged, 2 people circling the edges of a conversation neither was ready to have. Olivia broke it first. "They told me your name's clean. Real estate. No record." She tilted her head. "You don't shoot like a man who's never been shot at before." Something flickered behind his eyes. Recalculation, she would realize later. The split-second adjustment of a man whose entire life depended on knowing exactly how much truth a lie could survive. "I did 2 tours overseas before real estate," he said. "Some habits don't leave." It was, she thought, the kind of answer that sounded complete and wasn't. But she was exhausted and frightened and grateful in a way that made her chest ache, and so she let it sit instead of pulling at the thread. "Thank you," she said instead. I mean it. I don't know what would have happened if— Don't. His voice was quiet but absolute. You don't owe me gratitude for that. Some things you don't get to choose not to do. That sounds like a man with a complicated relationship to choice. For the first time since she'd met him, something that might have been the ghost of a smile moved across his face, there and gone so fast she almost missed it. Maybe. A nurse appeared at the curtain, informing Olivia that her father had arrived and was currently arguing with hospital security about visiting hours. And Damien, Dean, in this room, in this lie, went very still at the mention of Richard Bennett. A stillness Olivia mistook for politeness, and was in fact the precise, controlled stillness of a man recognizing the exact shape of the trap he'd walked into. I should go, he said. Will I see you again? The question left her before she decided to ask it, and she felt her face heat at how much want had leaked into her voice. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she felt the weight of it somewhere under her sternum, and then he reached into his jacket and set a card on the rolling table beside her bed. Dean Carter. Carter Property Group. A phone number that, unbeknownst to her, rang through to a burner that Marco replaced every 30 days. If you need anything, he said, call that number. He was gone before Richard Bennett pushed through the curtain 3 minutes later, full of fury and fear and the particular helplessness of a father who had spent his career protecting strangers and nearly lost the one person he couldn't survive losing. Olivia let her father hold her hand and ask his questions and promise, voice shaking with an anger she'd rarely heard from him, that whoever was responsible for this would answer for it. And she did not mention the man who had carried her out of the gunfire, because some instinct she didn't yet understand told her that this, of all things, was not a story she was ready to tell. Richard Bennett had not slept in his own bed in 3 days. He had not, in fact, slept much at all since the call had come in. Your daughter's been taken, sir. We have a location. Words that had detonated something in his chest he'd spent 10 years building scar tissue over. He sat now in his office on the 19th floor of the Dirksen Federal Building, surrounded by case files that had multiplied across his desk like a slow-growing tumour, and stared at a single name typed at the top of a fresh memo. Cross, Damien, Supplemental Investigation. The warehouse belongs to a shell corporation that traces back through 4 layers of LLCs to a holding company we've connected to Cross before, said Agent Maria Chen, standing across the desk with a tablet in hand. 3 of the 6 men killed were known Cross soldiers. One survivor, Frankie Dunlap, who's currently in critical condition at Cook County, was a capo under Cross for the better part of a decade. So Cross's own men kidnapped my daughter, Richard said, the words coming out of him like gravel. That's the working theory. What doesn't fit is the rescue. Chen turned the tablet to show him a grainy still from a gas station camera 2 blocks from the docks. A black SUV. A man's silhouette at the wheel. Nothing usable. Whoever pulled your daughter out of that warehouse killed 3 of Cross's own people to do it. That's not how an organisation rescues its own hostage. That's how a rival organisation steals one. Unless Cross didn't order the kidnapping at all, Richard said slowly, the shape of it assembling itself in his mind, with the particular clarity that a decade of obsession had sharpened to a fine point. Unless someone inside his own crew tried to use my daughter to bury him. And Cross went and cleaned it up himself, because he understood exactly what it would look like if he didn't. Chen didn't answer right away, which told Richard everything he needed to know. She'd already reached the same conclusion and hadn't wanted to be the one to say it first. Because it complicated a case they'd spent 2 years building towards something simple and devastating. RICO charges, witness testimony, the kind of conviction that would put Damien Cross away for the rest of his natural life. "It doesn't matter," Richard said finally, standing, walking to the window where the city spread out grey and indifferent below him. "Whether Cross ordered it or cleaned up after it, my daughter was taken because of who he is and what he's built. That's the only fact that matters to me." He pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose, exhaustion and old grief pulling at him in equal measure. He thought, as he often did in moments like this, of his brother James, 29 years old, an ambitious young agent who'd gone undercover inside the periphery of the Cross organization a decade ago and come home in a body bag. Collateral damage in a purge Damien Cross had ordered to consolidate power after his father's murder. Richard had buried his brother and rebuilt his entire career around a single, unbending purpose: that the man responsible would face a courtroom before he died, not a casket. "Sir," Chen said carefully, "I need to flag something. We've had unofficial contact, through an intermediary, from someone inside the Cross organization. Someone claiming they want to talk. Says they have documentation, financials, names, a paper trail that could finally make a RICO case stick instead of falling apart on us the way the last 3 attempts did." Richard turned from the window, something sharpening behind his tired eyes. "Who?" "We don't have a name yet. The intermediary's being careful. But if it's real..." "If it's real, it's the first real opening we've had in 10 years. Richard sat back down, pulling the newest file toward him, the weariness in his shoulders giving way just slightly to something harder and more familiar. Purpose. Pursue it. Carefully. If someone inside Cross's organization wants to hand him to us, I want to know everything about them before we take a single step that could spook them." He did not know, sitting in that office with the rain finally clearing over the Chicago skyline, that the intermediary in question represented a man named Salvatore Greco, a capo with ambitions larger than his patience, who had watched Frankie Dunlap's botched kidnapping scheme collapse and had quietly begun building a second, more careful version of the same plan, one that would not depend on something as clumsy as a hostage, and one that would not fail. He did not know that his daughter, 3 floors below him in a different federal building entirely, was sitting in her apartment at that exact moment, turning a business card over in her fingers and trying to convince herself that calling the number printed on it was not, in fact, the worst idea she'd had in years. And he certainly did not know that the man behind that number was the same man whose name sat typed at the top of the memo in front of him, the name he had spent 10 years chasing the way other men chase ghosts, close enough to feel the cold of them, never quite close enough to touch. The Lyric Opera House had been transformed for one night into the kind of glittering battlefield only Chicago's old money could construct. Chandeliers throwing gold light across marble floors, a string quartet soaring through something elegant and forgettable. The annual Bennett Foundation Gala, drawing senators and surgeons and the kind of philanthropists who wrote checks the way other people signed greeting cards. Olivia stood near the bar in a midnight blue gown she'd nearly talked herself out of wearing, nursing a glass of champagne she had no intention of finishing, half listening to a cardiologist explain his golf handicap in exhaustive detail. She saw him before she consciously registered why her pulse had changed. Dean Carter, Damien, though she still did not know that name, stood near the far windows in a black suit that fit him like a verdict, speaking with two men she didn't recognize, and for a moment she simply watched him the way you watch weather rolling in, aware that something was about to change and powerless to look away from it. He felt her gaze before he saw her. She watched the precise moment his attention shifted, the way his whole body seemed to recalibrate around the fact of her presence in the room. He crossed to her with unhurried purpose, and the cardiologist trailed off mid-sentence, sensing, the way prey senses larger predators, that the conversation had ended, whether he liked it or not. "Dr. Bennett." Dean's voice carried just enough formality to be appropriate for the room, and just enough warmth to undercut it entirely. "I didn't expect to see you here." "It's my father's foundation." She set her champagne down, suddenly very aware of her own hands. "I didn't expect to see you here, Mr. Carter. I thought real estate investors avoided rooms full of federal prosecutors." "Some of us find the company stimulating." His eyes held hers a beat longer than was strictly polite, and she felt the weight of 3 weeks of unanswered curiosity press up against the back of her throat. 3 weeks since the warehouse, 3 weeks of nearly calling the number on his card and talking herself out of it every time. "How's the concussion?" "Healed, mostly." She tilted her head. "You never called." "You never called either." "I didn't have a good excuse." "Neither did I," he said, and something about the directness of it disarmed her more than any practiced charm could have. "I told myself it wasn't appropriate. Man meets a woman in the middle of a crisis. There's a distortion. Gratitude masquerading as something else. And now? Now I'm standing here proving myself wrong." A faint, rare smile. "You're not grateful right now. You're annoyed that I didn't call." "I'm not—" She caught herself, laughed despite everything, the sound surprising her. "Fine. Maybe a little annoyed." Across the ballroom, a man in a sharp grey suit detached himself from a cluster of donors and made his way toward them with the confident gait of someone who'd never once doubted his own welcome anywhere. Trevor Lang, a hedge fund manager Olivia had dated briefly 2 years ago and broken up with for reasons that had mostly amounted to, "He never once asked about my day." He slid an arm around her waist with the easy familiarity of old habit before she could step back. "Liv, God, you look incredible." His eyes flicked, assessing to the man beside her. "Who's your friend?" "Dean Carter," Damien said, before Olivia could answer, his hand extending with perfect civility, his voice carrying no particular edge at all. And yet Olivia felt the temperature of the conversation drop several degrees, watched the way his gaze tracked the arm Trevor still had around her waist with an attention that was not jealousy exactly, or not only jealousy, but something colder and more proprietary underneath it. "And you are?" "Trevor Lang. Liv and I go way back." Trevor's grip tightened fractionally around her, an old performance of ownership he had no right to any more, and Olivia stepped sideways out of his arm with practiced ease. "We dated for 4 months 2 years ago, Trevor. That's not way back." "Details," Trevor laughed, oblivious or indifferent to how thin the ice beneath him had become. "We should catch up. I've got a table near the stage." "She's with me tonight," Damien said. It was 4 words delivered without raised volume, without any visible aggression at all, and yet something in the register of his voice made Trevor's easy confidence falter, made him glance almost involuntarily toward the door, the way a man glances toward an exit he hadn't previously thought he might need. Olivia felt it too, a current running under the words, and understood in a way she couldn't yet name that she had just witnessed something dangerous wearing very good manners. "Right, of course." Trevor recovered, forced a smile, retreated toward the bar with significantly less swagger than he'd arrived with. Olivia turned to Damien, eyebrow raised. "That was unnecessary."
Was it? He's harmless. I didn't say he was a threat. Damien's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes had. A flicker of a man surprised by his own behaviour, examining it with the same cold scrutiny he applied to everything else in his life. "I said he had his arm around you. I have no interest in being diplomatic about that." "You don't even know me." "No," he agreed quietly, "but I think about you. More than is reasonable for a man who's met you exactly once before tonight." He said it plainly, without flourish, the way some men confess crimes, already resigned to whatever consequence followed the admission. "I told myself I wouldn't say that. I'm finding I don't have much control over what I say around you." Olivia's heart was beating very fast, and the ballroom around them had narrowed to the small, charged distance between his shoulder and hers. "That's a dangerous thing to tell a woman you just met." "I'm aware." "Dance with me," she said, before sense could intervene, and held out her hand, and he took it like he'd been waiting his entire life for someone to ask. They didn't talk about the warehouse that night, or her father, or the strange gravitational pull that kept drawing them into orbit around each other across a city of 3 million people. Instead, 2 weeks after the gala, Damien took her to a restaurant on Randolph Street that didn't have a sign out front. The kind of place that existed for people who didn't need to be told where it was. And Olivia found herself somewhere between the second course and the wine she'd stopped pretending to sip slowly, simply talking about her residency, about the particular loneliness of being the only daughter of a man who measured love in late-night phone calls and missed birthdays, about the 7-year-old with the ruptured appendix who'd sent her a thank you card with a crayon drawing of a hospital that looked, charitably, like a haunted house. "You love it," Damien said, watching her with an intensity she was slowly growing accustomed to, though it never stopped doing something complicated to her pulse. "The job, even the parts that should break you. Someone has to be there at 3 in the morning when it all falls apart." She turned her wineglass by the stem, studying him in return. "What about you? What does Dean Carter love?" He was quiet for a moment, long enough that she thought she'd asked something he had no intention of answering. "I used to think it was winning," he said finally. "Building something. Being the last man standing in every room I walked into." His jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Lately, I'm not sure that's true anymore." "What changed?" His eyes met hers, and the silence between them filled with something neither of them said aloud, though both of them understood it perfectly. "I think you know," he said. She did know. She'd known for weeks, in the small hours when she should have been sleeping, turning over every interaction like evidence in a case she was building against her own good sense. There was something about him, a quality she couldn't name, a stillness that felt earned rather than performed, a way of looking at her like she was the only fixed point in a world that otherwise refused to stay still,
that had gotten under her skin in a manner no rational accounting of 3 encounters could explain.
"You make me nervous," she admitted. "Good or bad?" "I haven't decided." She smiled despite herself. "You're very controlled, almost unsettlingly so, and then every once in a while something slips, like right now." "I don't let things slip," he said, and there was an edge of something almost rueful in it. "Not any more. Not since I was young enough to think it was safe to." "What happened?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched him decide, visibly, not to answer that question fully. Watched the careful architecture of a man deciding exactly how much of himself was safe to hand to a stranger. "My family wasn't kind," he said finally. "I learned early that the things you let slip are the things people use against you." "And now? With me?" "With you," he said slowly, like he was confessing to a crime he hadn't fully forgiven himself for committing. "I keep finding reasons to let things slip anyway." They walked afterward along the river, the city lit up gold and indifferent above them, and somewhere on the Michigan Avenue Bridge, with the water moving black and silent below, he stopped walking and turned to face her, and the air between them went taut with a question neither of them had asked yet. "I should tell you something," he said, and for one suspended second, Olivia thought, hoped, feared, that the truth was finally about to surface, that the careful distance he kept around certain subjects was about to collapse into honesty. "I don't do this, whatever this is. I don't let myself want things I can't have without consequences." "And I'm a consequence? You're the first thing in 10 years I haven't been able to walk away from." His hand came up, slow, deliberate, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear with a gentleness that felt entirely at odds with the coiled tension she'd watched him carry since the moment they'd met. "That terrifies me more than anything I've faced in a long time." "Then don't walk away," she said, and closed the distance herself, rising onto her toes, and when his mouth finally met hers, it was nothing like she'd imagined, and everything she hadn't let herself imagine at all. Careful at first, like he was still deciding whether he had the right to want this, and then not careful at all. One hand sliding to the small of her back to pull her against him like he intended to memorize the exact shape of the moment. When they finally broke apart breathless, the city lights blurring gold around them, he rested his forehead against hers and exhaled like a man setting down a weight he'd carried for a very long time. "This is going to complicate things," he murmured. "Good things or bad things?" "I genuinely don't know any more," he said, and laughed, a real laugh, rough with disuse, and pulled her into his arms on a bridge above black water, neither of them aware of how literal his warning would turn out to be. Salvatore Greco had learned patience the way other men learn trades, slowly, through repetition, until it became indistinguishable from instinct. He sat now in the back room of a North Side social club that had been laundering the Cross organization's money since before Damien was born, listening to 2 of his most trusted capos report on a subject that had become, in recent weeks, an unexpected gift. "He's distracted," said Lucas Reyes, no relation to the Reyes who'd ridden with Damien to the docks, a different branch of a sprawling, loyal-on-paper organization that Salvatore had spent 3 years quietly seeding with doubt. "Skipping briefings, Took 2 days off last month. 2 days, Sal. You know Cross hasn't taken a day off since his father died. And there's a woman. We've had eyes on him. Bennett's daughter, of all the women in this city. Salvatore allowed himself a slow smile, the kind he reserved for moments when fortune handed him exactly what patience had promised it eventually would. The federal prosecutor's daughter. The same one Dunlap grabbed. And Cross is sleeping with her. Salvatore turned a glass of scotch in his hand, watching the light move through it. Do you understand what that means? Dunlap's plan failed because Dunlap was an idiot who thought a hostage was subtlety. But Cross has done something far more useful than getting caught with a hostage. He's fallen in love with the daughter of the one man on earth who wants him buried. He set the glass down. That's not a liability we have to manufacture. That's a liability he's building himself. One dinner at a time. What do you want to do with it? Nothing. Yet. Salvatore leaned back, steepling his fingers. A man distracted by a woman makes mistakes. He misses things. He gets soft in places he used to be hard. We let him keep falling, and when the time is right, we make sure the right people find out exactly who's been keeping his bed warm. He smiled again, colder this time. Agent Chen has been very patient with our intermediary. I think it's time we gave her something real. Not everything, just enough to keep her hungry. Financial records, a name or two she can verify, low enough on the ladder that losing them doesn't cost us anything that matters. And when Cross finds out someone's been talking to the feds, he'll assume it's Dunlap's people. Dead men make excellent scapegoats. They can't argue. Salvatore's expression hardened into something far less performative than his earlier amusement. Cross has held this organization together for 10 years on fear and bloodline. He killed 41 men to take this seat, Lucas. 41. Half of them barely deserved it. The other half were men I respected. He stood, smoothing his jacket, the picture of composed menace. I am not interested in waiting for him to die of old age in a penthouse he doesn't deserve, while the men who actually built this organization answer to a boy who got lucky surviving his father's enemies. I want him gone. I want the federal case to bury whatever's left of his reputation, so no one questions my hand on the wheel afterward. And I want it to happen in a way that makes the soldiers loyal to him understand very clearly that loyalty to a dead man is worth exactly nothing. He left the room without waiting for agreement, because in Salvatore Greco's experience, the men who needed convincing weren't the men worth keeping. 3 floors above his own penthouse, in a different part of the city entirely, Damien Cross stood at his window with his phone pressed to his ear, listening to Marco deliver a report that should have alarmed him far more than it did.
There's chatter, Marco said. Nothing concrete. But 2 capos mentioned an FBI intermediary feeding information out of our financial side. Low-level stuff, nothing that traces directly to you, but it's a leak, Damien, and we don't know who's holding the bucket. Find out. There's something else. Marco hesitated, and Damien recognized the particular caution in his oldest friend's voice as the precursor to something he didn't want to hear. People are talking about the woman, Olivia Bennett. Word's gotten around that you've been seeing her, discreetly, but not discreetly enough, apparently. Some of the older capos are uneasy. A boss with a weakness is a boss who gets tested. Damien looked out at the lake, black and vast beneath a sky without stars, and thought of her laugh on the Michigan Avenue Bridge.
The unguarded way she'd looked at him like he was a man worth wanting, instead of a weapon worth fearing. "Let them be uneasy," he said quietly, and hung up before Marco could press further. Though some cold, careful part of him, the part that had survived 10 years and 41 funerals, understood exactly how much danger that single sentence represented, and chose, for the first time in a decade, to ignore it anyway. The threat, when it came, did not come as a phone call or a note left on a windshield. It came as two men in a grey sedan trailing Olivia's car for 6 blocks on her drive home from a late shift, close enough that she noticed, far enough back that she told herself she was being paranoid, until the sedan's headlights filled her rearview mirror on the empty stretch of Lower Wacker Drive, and she understood, with the particular clarity terror provides, that paranoia had nothing to do with it. She called Damien, though she still didn't know it, with hands that shook so badly she nearly dropped the phone twice. "They're behind me," she said, voice cracking. "2 men, grey car. They've been there since the hospital." "Where exactly are you?" His voice had gone instantly, completely flat, every trace of warmth replaced by something clinical and razor-edged. "Lower Wacker, near Randolph." "Don't stop the car. Don't slow down. I'm 3 minutes out." A pause, and she heard him issuing orders to someone else, low and rapid, before his attention returned to her fully. "Olivia, listen to me. You're going to be fine. I need you to keep driving and keep talking to me." She did, narrating street signs through tears she hadn't realized she was crying, until headlights swung in hard from a side street ahead of her, and a black SUV cut between her car and the sedan with a violence that made her gasp. And then Damien was there, materializing out of the vehicle before it had fully stopped, weapon already drawn, and the 2 men in the grey sedan, recognizing exactly who had just arrived and exactly what that meant, reversed out of the underpass with a speed that suggested self-preservation had won out decisively over whatever instructions they'd been given. He was at her window in seconds, wrenching the door open, pulling her out and into his arms with a force that should have hurt, and somehow didn't, because she was shaking too hard to register pain, because the only thing that mattered in that moment was the solid, furious heartbeat against her cheek. "I'm here," he said into her hair, and his voice was not steady at all anymore. The careful control she'd come to associate with him cracked clean through. "I'm here. You're safe. I've got you." "Who were they?" she managed. His jaw worked, and for a long moment he said nothing, holding her like letting go was physically impossible. "I don't know yet," he said finally, "but I will." He drove her to her apartment himself, refused to leave, sat across from her at her own kitchen table while she made tea with hands that still trembled, and watched her with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not the careful warmth of the bridge, not the cold precision of the warehouse, but something raw and unguarded and frightened. A man confronting the possibility of a loss he hadn't fully understood. He couldn't survive. "This isn't random," he said quietly. "Someone's sending a message." "To who?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched something war behind his eyes. The careful architecture of every lie he'd told her, straining against a truth he clearly wanted, badly, to finally let through. "To me," he said. "I have enemies. In business. People who'd use anything they could against me, including you, if they thought it would work." "That's not a real estate problem, Dean." Her voice was quiet, but absolutely steady, the fear of the last hour curdling into something sharper. Real estate investors don't have enemies who send cars to follow women home. They don't have men who arrive in 3 minutes with a gun already in their hand. No, he agreed, they don't. So what are you? The question hung between them, enormous, and Olivia watched him stand at the edge of an honesty he'd clearly never planned to offer anyone. Watched the muscle in his jaw work as he decided, in real time, exactly how much of himself he could afford to give her without losing everything that protected them both. I'm a man who's made enemies, trying to survive a world I didn't choose to be born into, he said finally, carefully, every word weighed before it left his mouth. I'm not going to lie to you and tell you it's simple, because it isn't. And I'm not ready to tell you everything tonight, because some of it would put you in more danger than you're already in. But I need you to understand one thing absolutely. He reached across the table, took her trembling hands in both of his, steady and warm and unbearably certain. Whoever did this tonight, whoever they answer to, I will end them before I let them touch you again. That's not a promise I'm making lightly, Olivia. It's the only promise I have that matters. She should have been afraid of him in that moment. The cold finality in his voice, the absolute lack of hesitation in a vow that sounded less like comfort and more like a declaration of war. Instead, watching the fear in his eyes for her safety override every careful instinct he'd built his life around, she felt something in her chest settle into a certainty she couldn't yet name, though it would take her weeks longer to understand exactly what she'd fallen into, and whose enemies had just become, by extension, her own. He didn't leave that night, and neither of them pretended that not leaving meant anything other than what it meant. They sat together on her couch long after the tea had gone cold, his arm around her, her head against his chest, listening to the city hum 12 floors below her window, and somewhere in the unhurried quiet of 3 in the morning, the conversation gave way to something wordless, her fingers finding the collar of his shirt, his hand stilling against the small of her back, both of them understanding, without saying so, that whatever fear the night had carved into them had also stripped away the last of their careful distance. "Tell me to stop," he said quietly, his mouth at her temple, his voice rough with something that wasn't quite restraint anymore. "If you want me to stop, tell me now, because I don't think I'll have the discipline to manage it twice." "I don't want you to stop." She turned in his arms to face him fully, her hand coming up to rest against the side of his jaw, tracing the thin scar above his temple that she now knew the true shape of, though not yet the true cause. "I want you to stay." He kissed her like a man finally permitting himself something he'd spent weeks insisting he didn't deserve. Slow at first, deliberate, and then with a hunger that betrayed exactly how long he'd been holding himself back. She felt the careful control of him give way piece by piece, felt the weight of restraint he carried in every other part of his life dissolve into something that was, for once, entirely unguarded. And when he lifted her into his arms and carried her toward the bedroom, she understood that whatever else was true about him, whatever he hadn't told her, whatever shadow lived behind his eyes when he thought she wasn't watching, this, at least, was real. Whatever he was capable of in the rest of his life, in this room, with her, he was gentle,
in a way that felt like confession.
Afterward, in the dark, with her head on his chest and his fingers tracing slow, absent patterns along her spine, she felt him go quiet in a way that was different from his usual stillness. Heavier, more deliberate. The silence of a man working up to something he didn't want to say. Olivia. His voice was barely above a whisper. There's a version of my life where none of this is possible. Where I never walk into that warehouse, never see you again after that night, and everything stays simple and contained the way I built it to be. His hand stilled against her back. I keep thinking about that version. Not because I want it, because I'm trying to understand why I didn't choose it when I had the chance. And why didn't you? Because the first time I saw you, tied to that chair, terrified and still trying to warn me about a man behind my back, instead of begging for your own life. His voice caught, just barely, on something that sounded almost like wonder. I'd spent 10 years convincing myself that the kind of life I live doesn't leave room for anything except survival. And then there you were, doing something selfless in the middle of the worst night of your life. And I remember thinking, very clearly, I am going to ruin this woman's entire life by wanting her. You haven't ruined anything. Not yet. He said it so quietly, she almost didn't catch the weight underneath it, the particular grief of a man who could see further down a road than the woman walking it beside him. There are things about me you don't know. Things I haven't told you, because telling you would mean choosing between protecting you and being honest with you. And I haven't found a way to do both yet. Olivia pushed herself up on one elbow, studying his face in the grey pre-dawn light leaking through her curtains, and felt the first cold thread of real fear thread through the warmth of the night. Not fear of him exactly, but fear of the shape of whatever truth he kept circling without landing on. Are you going to tell me? Yes. He met her eyes, and there was something almost like relief in the admission, the relief of a man finally setting a date for a reckoning he'd been postponing out of cowardice he wasn't proud of. Not tonight. Not because I don't trust you. Because once I tell you, there's no version of this where things stay simple. And I'm selfish enough that I want one more night of simple before I give that up. His thumb traced her cheekbone, achingly gentle. Stay angry with me for that if you need to. I'd rather you angry and safe than informed and in danger before I've found a way to protect you from what comes after the truth. She didn't push that night. She told herself it was patience or trust or the particular exhaustion that came after fear and tea and tenderness in the same long night. It would be weeks before she understood that what she'd actually been given in that grey pre-dawn light was a kindness disguised as a delay, and longer still before she understood exactly how much that delay would cost them both. The trauma page came in at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, the way most things that destroy carefully constructed lives tend to arrive without ceremony. A gunshot wound to the chest. Male, mid-40s, GCS dropping fast. ETA, 4 minutes. Olivia was already moving toward the trauma bay before the overhead page finished, pulling on gloves, calling out orders, her mind narrowing into the particular tunnel vision that had carried her through 6 years of nights exactly like this one. The paramedics wheeled him in, talking fast. Gunshot wound, left chest, decreased breath sounds on the left. BP's dropping. We think there's a federal protective detail inbound. And Olivia clocked the last detail without fully processing it. Too busy assessing the airway, the chest rise, the blood already soaking through the makeshift dressing someone had pressed against the wound in transit. "He's got a tension pneumo," she said, already reaching for a needle. "Get me a chest tube tray, now." The man on the table was conscious, barely, his eyes rolling toward her with the particular desperate focus of someone who understood on some animal level that the next 10 minutes would decide everything. "Don't let me die," he managed, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. I have to testify. I have to." "You're not dying tonight," Olivia said, with the flat, absolute certainty she'd learned to manufacture even when she didn't feel it, decompressing his chest with practiced speed, watching his oxygen saturation climb back from the edge of catastrophe. "I need you to stop talking and let me work." It was 40 minutes later, after the chest tube was placed and the bleeding controlled and the patient stabilized enough to be wheeled toward the OR for definitive repair, that Olivia learned his name from the chart a nurse handed her. Webb, Marcus, 47. And felt something cold drop through her stomach as she registered the federal agents now stationed outside the trauma bay doors, the careful, watchful presence of Agent Maria Chen speaking in low tones with the charge nurse. She knew the name. She'd overheard it twice in the last month, drifting through her father's increasingly distracted phone calls at the rare dinners they still managed together. Webb's testimony is the whole case. If we lose him, we lose 10 years. Said with the particular weight Richard Bennett reserved for things he considered sacred. Marcus Webb. The witness. The one piece of evidence that could finally put Damien Cross, and, by extension, though her father didn't know it, the man currently asleep in Olivia's bed 3 miles away, behind bars for the rest of his life. She stood very still for a moment in the scrub hallway, the OR doors swinging shut behind the gurney, and felt the entire architecture of her life rearrange itself around a single, impossible fact. The man she had sworn an oath to save was the man whose survival might destroy the man she loved. "Dr. Bennett?" Agent Chen's voice pulled her back into the hallway. "I need to ask you some questions about Mr. Webb's condition, and I need to inform you that, as of tonight, he's under federal protective custody. Anything discussed regarding his case needs to stay strictly within appropriate channels." "Of course." Olivia's voice came out steadier than she felt. "He's critical but stable. He'll need surgery within the hour to repair the damage and control the bleeding properly." I was about to scrub in. "Good. We need him to survive this, Doctor. More than you probably understand." "You have no idea how much I understand," Olivia thought, and said nothing, because the truth sitting in her chest had no safe place to go. Not to Agent Chen, not to her father, not even, yet, to the man whose entire fate now rested with a cruelty she hadn't seen coming in her own 2 hands. She scrubbed in 15 minutes later with thoughts she couldn't afford to have, every motion automatic, trained, while underneath the surface of her concentration a single question repeated itself with the relentless rhythm of a second pulse. If I save him, I help bury Dean. If I let him die, I become someone I will never be able to look at in a mirror again. There was, in the end, no real choice at all, not for a woman who had built her entire life around the principle that every patient who came through her doors deserved every fragment of skill she possessed, regardless of what their survival cost anyone else, including her. She made the first incision with hands that did not shake, because shaking hands killed people, and whatever war was happening in the rest of her life, the man on the table in front of her had a body that needed fixing and a heart that needed to keep beating, and that, for the length of the surgery, was the only fact in the universe that mattered. It took 2 hours and 11 minutes. Marcus Webb survived. Olivia walked out of the OR at dawn, peeling off her gloves, her hands finally beginning to tremble now that the surgery no longer required them steady, and found her father waiting in the hallway outside. Not for the patient, she realised with a sick jolt, but for her. Having heard second-hand through the federal grapevine that his daughter had been the one to save the life of the witness who would finally bring down his decade-long obsession. Liv. Richard Bennett's face carried an expression she hadn't seen on him in years, something almost like awe, mixed with a grief so old it had calcified into permanence. You saved him. Do you understand what that means? This case, everything I've worked for since James died, it has a chance now, a real chance. He pulled her into a hug that smelled like the same cologne he'd worn her whole childhood, and Olivia stood rigid in her father's arms, unable to tell him that the thing he was celebrating might be the exact thing that broke her heart in half. She didn't tell Damien about Marcus Webb that week. She told herself it was hospital confidentiality, federal protective custody, the simple professional reality that she couldn't discuss patients. And all of that was true, and none of it was the reason. The reason was simpler and far more cowardly. She didn't yet know how to hold both halves of her life in the same hand without one of them crushing the other. It was her father who forced the reckoning, 3 days later, over a dinner she'd agreed to out of guilt for how distant she'd been since the surgery. "The case is finally moving," Richard said, colour back in his face for the first time in years, looking 10 years younger than the exhausted man who'd sat in his office, surrounded by case files a month earlier. Webb's testimony, combined with the financial records Agent Chen's intermediary has been feeding us, we have enough now to bring the indictment within the month. Damien Cross. He said the name like a curse he'd been saving for a decade, savouring the shape of it now that it finally had teeth. RICO. Conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering going back 15 years. We're going to put him away for the rest of his life, Liv. After everything. After James. After what happened to you. What happens to Webb in the meantime? She asked, focusing on her plate, on anything that wasn't her father's face. Protective custody until trial, round-the-clock detail. Richard studied her, some paternal instinct flickering behind the triumph. You've been quiet. Is everything all right? You've barely mentioned that man you brought to the gala last month. Carter, was it? I half expected to hear more about him by now. It's complicated, Olivia said, which was, she thought bitterly, the single truest sentence she'd spoken in weeks. Complicated how? He's careful, guarded. There's things about him I don't fully understand yet. She forced herself to look up, to meet her father's eyes, hating every word of the half-truth she was about to offer. I'm still figuring out if it's worth the trouble. Richard reached across the table, covered her hand with his own, the same gesture he'd used her whole life, every scraped knee and broken heart met with that same steady weight. After what happened to you at those docks, sweetheart, you deserve a life with less danger in it, not more. Whoever this Carter is, if he's worth keeping, he'll understand that you need to feel safe before anything else. If you only knew, Olivia thought, and felt something inside her chest crack quietly down the middle, because the man she'd given her heart to was, by every metric her father's career had ever measured, the single most dangerous man in the city, and the danger her father feared on her behalf was the exact danger she'd already walked directly into, eyes open, heart first. She went to Damien's penthouse that night, unable to stay away, unable to find words for the things splitting her in half, and found him at his window the way she increasingly found him, standing in the dark, watching the lake, carrying himself like a man perpetually braced for news he didn't want to hear.
"You're quiet tonight," he said, without turning. "I had dinner with my father." Something in his shoulders went very still. "How is he?" "Closer to something he's wanted for 10 years. She crossed the room, stood beside him at the window, watching the same black water he'd been watching. "He's going to indict someone soon. He says it's the case of his career, says it's finally going to give him peace after what happened to his brother." She turned to look at him directly. "Do you know anything about that, Dean? About a man my father's spent a decade trying to destroy?" The silence that followed lasted long enough that she felt its weight settle into her bones, watched him war, visibly, with something enormous behind his carefully composed face. "Olivia." His voice, when it came, was low and rough, with something that sounded dangerously close to grief. "I told you there were things I needed to tell you. I think that time is closer than either of us wants it to be." "Then tell me now." He turned to face her fully, and for one suspended moment she watched him gather himself, the way she imagined he'd once gathered himself before walking into rooms full of armed men, bracing for violence. Except the violence this time was entirely his to deliver, aimed at the only thing in his life he'd let himself want without calculation. "Not tonight," he said finally, and the cowardice in it was so unlike him that it frightened her more than honesty would have. I need to handle something first. Something that, if it goes wrong, could put you in more danger than you've already been in. Give me a little more time, please." She wanted to push. Every rational instinct told her to push, to demand the truth standing right there in front of a man clearly drowning in the weight of withholding it. But some older, more frightened part of her, the part that had spent a decade watching her father sacrifice everything to a single unbending mission, recognized the particular exhaustion in Damien's eyes, and could not bring herself to add to it. Not yet. Not until she understood what storm was actually coming for both of them. "Okay," she said softly, and hated herself a little for the relief that flickered across his face at her capitulation. Because some quiet, unacknowledged part of her had already begun to suspect that the truth, when it finally arrived, would not be survivable for either of them in the shape their relationship currently existed. Salvatore Greco's intermediary delivered the second package of evidence to Agent Maria Chen on a Thursday afternoon in a parking garage off LaSalle Street in an exchange that lasted 90 seconds and would, within a month, reshape the futures of every person connected to it. Financial records, shell company structures, a ledger detailing payments that traced, with damning specificity, directly to accounts controlled by Damien Cross. "This is real," Chen told Richard that evening, spreading the documents across his desk with the careful reverence of someone handling something sacred.
This isn't circumstantial anymore. Combined with Webb's testimony, this gives us motive, means, and a financial trail that a jury can actually follow. We could have an indictment ready inside 3 weeks. Richard Bennett looked at the documents for a long time without speaking, and Chen, watching him, understood that she was witnessing the closing of a decade-long wound. Not healing, exactly, but the long-delayed arrival of something that might finally let the wound begin to close. 10 years, he said, finally, quietly. James would have been 39 this year. He had a daughter, you know, 8 months old when he died. She's 19 now. Doesn't remember her father at all. He set the documents down with the careful precision of a man handling something both precious and unbearable. Make sure this is airtight, Maria. I am not losing this case to a procedural technicality after everything it's cost to get here. What neither of them knew, what no one outside Salvatore Greco's innermost circle yet understood, was that the documents had been curated with surgical precision. Every name and figure chosen specifically because losing them cost Salvatore nothing, while devastating Damien completely. It was, in its own way, as elegant a betrayal as the warehouse kidnapping had been clumsy. And Salvatore allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction watching his careful architecture take shape from a distance. Through informants embedded deep enough in the federal building's support staff to confirm that the documents had landed exactly where intended. Damien learned of the leak's scope 2 days later, when Marco arrived at the penthouse with a face that had gone grey with the particular dread of a man delivering news he knew would detonate something irreversible. "It's worse than financial records," Marco said, dropping a folder on the kitchen island Damien rarely used for anything but paperwork. "I had someone inside the federal building confirm it. They have Webb's testimony locked down under protective custody, and now they have a documentation trail that traces directly to your personal accounts. Damien, this isn't a leak anymore. This is a coordinated effort to bury you, and it's coming from inside our own organization. I'd bet my life on it." "Greco," Damien said. "It wasn't a question. I can't prove it yet. But the timing, the specificity, only someone with access to your personal financial structure could have curated something this precise." Dunlap was an idiot who tried something clumsy and died for it. This is someone smarter, someone who's been planning longer, someone patient enough to let the first attempt fail because it gave them cover for the second. Damien stood at the window, the way he always stood at the window when the weight of his life threatened to become unbearable, and felt the full shape of the trap close around him with a clarity that was almost peaceful in its inevitability. If Webb testifies and the financial trail holds, what's our exposure? Total. Marco didn't soften it. RICO charges with this much corroborating evidence. There's no plea that keeps you out of a federal facility for the rest of your natural life. We're talking decades, Damien. We're talking the rest of your existence. And if Webb doesn't make it to trial? Marco's silence carried its own answer. The particular silence of a loyal man being asked to consider something he didn't want to consider. He's under federal protective custody, round the clock. Getting to him would be, "I'm not asking you to get to him." Damien's voice had gone flat, dangerous, the voice Marco had heard exactly 4 times in 15 years of friendship, each time preceding violence that reshaped the city. "I'm asking whether Greco would consider it, if he understood it would end the case before it started." Greco doesn't want the case to end.
He wants the case to bury you specifically, so he can take your seat clean, with the federal government's blessing, painting you as the villain who deserved exactly what happened to him.
Marco met his oldest friend's eyes directly. This was never about getting you convicted, Damien. It's about making sure that when you go down, everyone left standing believes you deserved it, and nobody questions who steps into the throne afterward. Damien closed his eyes, and for the first time in 10 years allowed himself to feel the full weight of exhaustion he'd spent a decade refusing to acknowledge. The particular tiredness of a man who had built an empire out of blood and now understood, with absolute clarity, that the only way out of it might cost him the one thing he'd finally let himself want without calculation. Olivia's father was the prosecutor building the case that would bury him. Olivia's safety depended on a federal protective detail guarding the witness whose testimony would seal his fate. Every road forward led directly through the woman he loved, and there was no version of the truth waiting on the other side of this that didn't risk losing her completely. "Find Greco's intermediary," he said finally, opening his eyes, his voice steady again, dangerous in its renewed control. "I want to know exactly how far this goes, and I want to know before he realizes I'm looking." The threat to Olivia's safety after Lower Wacker Drive had quieted, but not vanished. Damien had assigned 2 of his most trusted men to discreet rotating surveillance outside her apartment and the hospital, a fact he hadn't told her, certain she'd object to the loss of privacy more than she'd appreciate the security. It was one of those men, Cole, who first noticed a different kind of threat approaching her. Not violence this time, but something almost worse in its way. Familiarity. Trevor Lang had apparently decided that the gala's humiliation deserved a second attempt, and arrived at Lakeshore General on a Friday afternoon with flowers and the particular confidence of a man who had never once internalized rejection as a permanent condition. Olivia was crossing the hospital lobby when he intercepted her, and Cole, watching from a discreet distance near the gift shop, made a phone call he suspected his boss would not thank him for making and would absolutely have wanted regardless. "I know the gala was a disaster," Trevor said, holding out flowers Olivia had no intention of accepting. "But Liv, come on. 4 months wasn't nothing. We were good together before I got stupid about work." "Trevor, I'm seeing someone." "That real estate guy?" Trevor's easy charm flickered, something more proprietary surfacing beneath it. He seemed intense. "I did some digging, actually. Couldn't find much on him. No social media, barely any public footprint for a guy who supposedly owns half the North Shore. You don't think that's strange?" Olivia felt something cold move through her, the particular vertigo of hearing someone else voice the exact unease she'd been suppressing for weeks. "People are allowed privacy, Trevor." "Sure. Or people are allowed to be hiding something." He said it lightly, but the words landed with more weight than he likely intended, and Olivia was still absorbing them when a voice behind her, calm and very cold, cut through the lobby's ambient noise. "Is there a problem here?" She turned to find Damien standing a few feet away, having arrived, she would later learn, within 4 minutes of Cole's phone call, and the change that came over Trevor's face at the sight of him was almost comic in its speed, the swagger evaporating, replaced by the particular wariness of a man recognizing on some animal level that he had wandered into territory far more dangerous than a romantic rival. "No problem," Trevor said quickly. "Just catching up." "You've caught up." Damien's voice carried no heat at all, which somehow made it more frightening than if it had.
I'd suggest you don't make a habit of catching up with Dr. Bennett going forward.
Trevor left without his flowers, and Olivia watched him go with a complicated tangle of feelings she didn't have time to untangle before turning her full attention back to Damien, whose expression had shifted, the moment Trevor was gone, into something far less composed. "You're having me watched," she said. "Yes." The simplicity of the admission, offered without apology or hesitation, threw her more than evasion would have. "You don't get to do that without telling me, Dean." "I do, actually, when the alternative is finding out something happened to you after the fact instead of before it." His jaw was tight, his eyes carrying the particular intensity she'd come to recognize as fear dressed up as control. "I've already failed to protect you from danger once. I'm not doing it twice because you objected to surveillance you didn't ask for. That's not your decision to make alone." "No," he agreed, something raw breaking through the careful composure. "It isn't. But I'd rather have this argument with you angry and breathing than skip it entirely and bury you instead." He reached for her hand, and she let him take it despite the irritation still simmering beneath her skin, because the fear in his voice was real, unguarded, in a way she'd rarely seen from him. "I know what I am to you right now is incomplete. A name that doesn't fully add up. A man who disappears for hours without explanation, who has people watching your apartment without asking. I know all of that is its own kind of cruelty, and I am going to fix it. But I need you to understand that whatever else is true about me, the thing underneath all of it, wanting you safe, wanting you breathing, wanting you in my life for longer than either of us has any right to expect, that part isn't a lie. That part is the only thing about me I've never had to construct." Olivia studied his face, the particular exhaustion behind his eyes, the way his hand tightened around hers like releasing it physically pained him, and felt the last of her irritation give way to something more complicated, not quite forgiveness, not quite understanding, but a recognition that whatever truth he was protecting her from, the protecting itself had cost him something real. "Trevor said he couldn't find anything about you online," she said quietly. "No footprint. Nothing that matches a man who supposedly owns half the North Shore." Something flickered behind Damien's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, that the careful architecture of Dean Carter was beginning to show its seams under scrutiny it had never been built to withstand. "Trevor should mind his own business," he said, and the deflection was so unlike his usual directness that Olivia felt the cold thread of unease from dinner with her father return, twisting tighter. "Dean," her voice had gone very quiet, "is there a version of this where you tell me the truth before someone else does?" "Yes," he said, and the certainty in it was the only comfort he could offer. "I promise you, soon, before anyone else has the chance to." He didn't know, standing in that hospital lobby, with her hand in his, how little time that promise actually had left to keep. The storm rolled in off the lake on a Saturday night, with a violence that knocked out power across 3 Northside neighbourhoods, and Olivia, who'd let herself into Damien's penthouse with the key he'd given her 2 weeks earlier, a small, enormous gesture neither of them had commented on directly, was searching by phone flashlight for candles in his study when she found the recorder instead. It sat in the bottom drawer of his desk, beneath a stack of documents she hadn't meant to disturb, a small black device with a single red light blinking steady in the dark. She told herself, even as her fingers closed around it, that she wasn't looking for anything, that this was an accident of a blackout, and a desk drawer that had simply opened too easily. And she told herself that lie for exactly as long as it took to press play and hear Marco Falcone's voice crackle out of the small speaker. The indictment's coming within the month, Damien. Webb's testimony plus the financial trail Greco leaked. There's no surviving this as Damien Cross. We need a plan for if you're arrested, and we need to know what happens to the organization, and we need to know what happens to her. Olivia's blood went to ice. She sat down hard in the desk chair, the recorder shaking in her hand, and listened to the rest of it. Marco's voice, urgent and afraid in a way she'd never heard a grown man sound. Damien's voice, low and controlled, answering questions about contingencies, about Greco, about a federal case being built against a man named Damien Cross, with a precision and intimacy that left absolutely no room for misunderstanding. Dean Carter and Damien Cross are the same man. The thought arrived whole and total, and underneath it, a second realization crashed down with equal force. The federal prosecutor building the case against him is my father. The witness I saved is testifying against him. I have been sleeping with the single most wanted man in this city, and he let me find out from a recording in a drawer instead of from his own mouth. She didn't hear him come in. She was still sitting there, the recorder clutched in her white-knuckled hand, when the door opened, and Damien Cross, she understood now, fully and finally, stepped into the study and saw her face in the candlelight she'd finally managed to light, and understood, in the space of a single held breath, exactly what she now knew. Olivia. Damien Cross. Her voice came out flat, stripped of everything except the precise, terrible calm of someone standing at the edge of a collapse they hadn't yet allowed themselves to fall into. That's your real name. He didn't deny it. He didn't move toward her either, standing instead in the doorway like a man who understood, with absolute clarity, that closing the distance now would be its own kind of violation. Yes. My father has spent 10 years trying to put you in prison for the rest of your life. Her voice cracked finally on the word prison, the calm fracturing into something raw and furious. The man I saved on an operating table 3 weeks ago is testifying against you. My uncle died because of a war your father started. Every single thing about my life that you knew when you walked into that warehouse, you knew exactly who I was. You knew exactly whose daughter you were rescuing. Yes, he said again, quieter, because there was no version of denial available to him anymore, and he seemed to understand that lying further would be its own unforgivable cruelty. Were you using me? The question came out raw, stripped of every careful defence she'd built over the last 2 months. Was any of this real? Or was I just a way to keep tabs on my father's case, a way to see what he knew before he knew it? No. The word came out of him with a force that made her flinch, his composure finally, completely breaking, the careful distance he'd maintained in the doorway collapsing as he crossed the room toward her, stopping just short of touching her, his hands hovering like he didn't trust himself to reach for her, and didn't trust himself not to. Olivia, look at me. I have never once used you for information about your father's case. I have spent 2 months terrified that the truth would cost me exactly this moment, and I let that fear make me a coward, and I am so sorry that you found out like this instead of from me, but I swear to you, Everything I have told you about how I feel, every single moment we've spent together, none of that was a lie. The only lie was the name. The only lie. Her laugh came out broken, disbelieving. Damien, the name is the lie. The name is everything. You let me fall in love with a man who doesn't exist. I let you fall in love with me, he said, his voice breaking now too, something she had never heard from him, not even with 3 bullets nearly finding her in a warehouse. Everything you know about how I think, how I feel, what I want, that's not Dean Carter's invention. That's mine. The name was armor. It was never supposed to be the truth between us. Thunder cracked outside, close enough to rattle the windows, and Olivia stood there in the candle-lit dark, the recorder still clutched in her hand, looking at the face of a man she'd spent 2 months falling in love with, and seeing for the first time the full weight of exactly who he was. The man her father had hunted for a decade, the man whose organization had killed her uncle, the man whose freedom and her father's life's work now stood in direct, irreconcilable opposition. I need you to leave, she said quietly. Olivia, please. Her voice broke completely on the word. Please, Damien. I can't. I need you to leave right now, before I say something I can't take back, because right now I don't know if I hate you or if I still love you, and I cannot stand here and figure that out with you watching. He left. It was, she understood later, the hardest thing she'd ever watched a man do. Not the leaving itself, but the visible cost of it, the way he stood in the doorway for one final second, like leaving might actually kill him, before he turned and walked out into the storm without another word, because she had asked him to, and because for the first time in 10 years, Damien Cross had finally found something he was willing to lose a fight over, her right to ask, and his obligation to listen. Olivia did not sleep that night, or the night after. She sat with the recorder on her kitchen counter like an artifact from someone else's life, replaying Marco's voice, replaying Damien's voice, replaying the precise moment her entire understanding of the last 2 months had rearranged itself into something unrecognizable. She thought about the warehouse, Dean Carter, real estate investor, wrong place, wrong time, and understood now that every word of that introduction had been constructed with the same precision he brought to everything. A man who built false architecture the way other people built houses, sturdy enough to live in for as long as necessary. And yet... She thought, too, about the grey pre-dawn light after the men in the grey sedan, his voice cracking with something that hadn't been performance. She thought about the bridge over the river, his hand at her cheek, the rare, unguarded laugh that had startled even him. She thought about the way he'd looked at her across 2 months of careful half-truths, like she was the only fixed point in a world that refused to stay still. And she understood, with a clarity that made the grief worse rather than better, that both things were true simultaneously. He had lied to her about everything that mattered to the rest of the world, and he had been entirely, devastatingly honest about the only thing that had ever mattered to her. It was Marco who finally came to her 3 days later, standing awkwardly outside her apartment door with the particular discomfort of a man unaccustomed to diplomacy. He didn't send me, Marco said, before she could close the door. He doesn't know I'm here. I came because I've known him since he was 11 years old, watching his father teach him to shoot in a basement that smelled like gun oil and fear. and I have never once, in 23 years, seen him the way he's been since you walked out of that room." "What do you want me to do with that, Marco?" "Nothing. I just want you to know the truth, since apparently that's been in short supply." Marco's jaw tightened. He spent 10 years building a life where caring about anyone was a liability he refused to carry. His father taught him that. Love gets people killed in this world. Attachment is a weapon your enemies use against you. And he believed it, completely, until you. He's not a good man, Dr. Bennett. I won't insult you by pretending otherwise. But what he feels for you isn't part of the lie. It's the one thing in his entire life that never was. He let my father build a case that could put him away for life while sleeping with the prosecutor's daughter. He let himself fall for you, despite knowing exactly what it would cost him, because apparently you were worth the cost. Marco's voice softened, just slightly. He hasn't slept in 3 days either, if it matters to you at all. He's not eating. Damien Cross has survived 3 assassination attempts and a federal investigation that's been hunting him for a decade, and the thing currently breaking him is a woman telling him to leave. Olivia closed her eyes, the grief and fury still tangled together in her chest in a knot she couldn't yet untangle. "What do you want, Marco?" "I want you to talk to him. Not for his sake. I genuinely don't care if that helps him or not. That's not why I'm here. I'm here because I think you deserve to actually hear the whole truth from the man who owes it to you, instead of piecing it together from a recorder and your own imagination." He turned to leave, then paused. "There's something else you should know, something bigger than the two of you. There's a man inside the organization, Salvatore Greco, who's been feeding evidence to the federal government specifically to bury Damien, not because he cares about justice, but because he wants Damien's throne. He's the one who orchestrated your kidnapping at the docks. He's the one who sent men to follow you on Lower Wacker. Whatever you decide about Damien, you should know that the danger around you was never really about him. It was about a man using you as a weapon against him, the same way he tried to use your father's case as one." He left her standing in her doorway with that new weight added to everything else, and Olivia spent another sleepless night reconciling the architecture of a war she'd been standing inside for 2 months without understanding its true shape. She went to him on the 4th day. He opened the door himself, and the toll Marco had described was visible immediately. Hollowed, exhausted, a man who had clearly not slept any more than she had. "I'm not here to forgive you," she said, before he could speak. "I don't know if I can do that yet. I'm here because I want the entire truth, all of it, no more careful editing for my protection. If you want any version of a future with me, that's the price. And I need you to understand it's non-negotiable." "Okay," Damien said simply, stepping back to let her in. And for the next 3 hours, he told her everything. His father's purge, the 41 names, the organization he'd inherited and the violence required to hold it, Salvatore Greco's slow betrayal, the truth about the warehouse and Dunlap's failed scheme, and exactly how much danger she'd actually been in every single time he'd shown up to save her. He held nothing back, watching her face for every flicker of horror and disgust she didn't bother to hide. Because she had asked for the truth, and he understood, finally, that protecting her from it had only ever been a more sophisticated form of the same cowardice. My father is going to win, she said when he finished, her voice hollow with the particular exhaustion of grief that hadn't found its bottom yet. He's going to indict you. He's going to win the thing he's wanted for 10 years, and I don't know how to feel about that anymore, because some part of me still loves you, and some part of me will always be his daughter. And I don't know how a person survives wanting both of those things at once. I don't know either, Damien admitted, and the honesty of not knowing, after 2 months of careful, constructed certainty, was somehow the most genuine thing he'd ever told her. But I'd rather face whatever comes with you knowing the truth than keep you in the dark a single day longer. Whatever you decide to do with what I've told you, even if it's walking out that door and never coming back, you deserved the truth before you made that choice. Richard Bennett found out 3 days later, not through surveillance or instinct, but because Agent Maria Chen, reviewing routine security footage from outside the federal building as a precaution following the second evidence leak, flagged a vehicle that had been parked near Olivia's apartment building with unusual frequency over the previous 6 weeks. A black SUV registered, after careful tracing, to a holding company connected through 4 layers of shell corporations to Damien Cross. She brought it to Richard with the particular gentleness of someone delivering news she knew would detonate something irreversible. "Sir, I need you to look at this before I file it anywhere official." Richard studied the footage for a long time without speaking. His daughter's building, the SUV's careful, repeated presence, and then, in a frame Chen had circled in red, a clear shot of Damien Cross himself, stepping out of the vehicle, standing at Olivia's building's entrance, with the unmistakable bearing of a man with a key. "There has to be an explanation," Richard said, though his voice had already begun to hollow out with the dawning shape of one he didn't want. "Sir, I cross-referenced the gala guest list from the Bennett Foundation event 6 weeks ago. Dean Carter, real estate investor. The alias matches financial records we've connected to one of Cross's shell companies." "I think your daughter has been seeing Damien Cross for approximately 2 months, sir, and I think she may not have known who he actually was until very recently, based on patterns in the surveillance." Richard sat very still in his office chair. The case files that had defined a decade of his life spread across the desk in front of him, and felt something he hadn't felt since the day he'd identified his brother's body. The particular vertigo of a world rearranging itself faster than he could keep pace with it. "Does anyone else know?" he asked finally. "Not yet. I came to you first." "Keep it that way." His voice had gone hard, the prosecutor's voice, the voice that had built a career out of unbending purpose. "I need to think about how to handle this before it becomes part of any official record." He went to Olivia's apartment that night and found her sitting alone in the dark, looking like she hadn't slept properly in days, and the moment she opened the door and saw his face, she understood that whatever careful architecture had been holding her secret together had finally collapsed. "You know," she said, it wasn't a question. "Tell me it isn't true." Richard's voice cracked. 10 years of fury and grief finally finding a target close enough to wound. "Tell me you didn't fall in love with the man who killed your uncle's killers and inherited his father's empire and has spent 10 years building the kind of organization that destroys everything it touches." "I didn't know, Dad. Not at first. He lied to me. About his name, about everything. And by the time I found out, it was already—" Her voice broke. "It was already real. I love him. I know what that means. I know who he is. I know everything you've spent your career trying to prove about him, and I still can't make myself stop." Richard sat down heavily on her couch, the fury draining out of him into something far more exhausted and far more frightening. Grief, old and unresolved, finally finding a new wound to pour itself into. "James was 29 years old," he said quietly. "He had a daughter 8 months old. He went undercover because he believed in something, and Damien Cross's father had him killed because he was inconvenient to a war that man started over territory he didn't even need. I have spent 10 years making sure that death meant something, and now you're telling me you love the son of the man who ordered it." Damien didn't order James's death. He was 24. He was burying his own father at the time. He built an empire on the back of that war, Olivia. He benefited from every single death that war produced, including your uncle's. Richard's hands were shaking, the precise, careful control of a decade-long prosecutor finally splintering under weight he'd never planned to carry. "I have an indictment ready. Webb's testimony, financial records, everything I need to finally finish this. And my own daughter is in love with the man at the centre of it." "What are you going to do?" Olivia's voice was very quiet, very afraid. Richard looked at his daughter for a long time, watching the fear and grief and stubborn, unbending love on her face, the same face that had looked up at him 1,000 times across a childhood spent waiting for a father who chased monsters instead of coming home for dinner, and felt the entire shape of his decade-long mission collide, for the first time, with something he valued even more than justice. "I could use this," he said slowly, almost to himself. "Your relationship with him. It would be leverage no defense attorney could counter, evidence of consciousness of guilt, evidence that he's compromised the case through personal entanglement with the prosecutor's family. I could destroy him faster and more completely than Webb's testimony ever could." He looked at his daughter's face, at the terror dawning there, and felt something inside him recoil from the thought, even as the prosecutor in him calculated its effectiveness. "And it would destroy you in the process, publicly, permanently." "Dad, I'm not going to do that." The words came out of him like a confession, like he was surprising himself with the decision even as he made it. 10 years, Olivia. 10 years I've told myself that justice mattered more than anything else, that James's death demanded a price that nothing could be allowed to interfere with. And I am looking at my daughter's face right now, and I find I don't actually believe that anymore. Not if the cost is you. He reached for her hand, the same gesture he'd used her entire life. "I am still going to prosecute Damien Cross to the absolute fullest extent the law allows. That has not changed, and it will not change, because James deserves that, and so does every other family that organization has destroyed. But I am not going to use you to do it. I will find another way, or I will lose, but I will not turn my own daughter into evidence." Olivia put her arms around her father and cried for the first time in days, grief and gratitude tangled together so completely she couldn't separate them. While outside her window, the city continued exactly as it always had, indifferent to the fact that 2 of its most determined men were now locked on a collision course that no amount of love, on either side, would be enough to stop. Salvatore Greco had spent 3 years building toward this moment, and he intended to enjoy every second of its execution.
The federal hearing, a procedural arraignment that would formally enter Webb's testimony and the financial records into the court record,
A public event with reporters and cameras, and crucially, both Richard Bennett and a subpoenaed Damien Cross required to appear in the same building on the same morning, represented an opportunity too perfect to leave to chance. 2 shooters, he told his innermost circle. Men he'd spent years cultivating, with promises of a future under his leadership instead of Damien's. Positioned in the parking structure across from the courthouse. When Cross and Bennett exit together, and they will, the hearing's been scheduled specifically so both men leave through the same security checkpoint. Both men go down. We make it look like a confrontation between them went bad. Cross's people retaliating against the prosecutor who's been hunting him. Bennett's federal detail returning fire. By the time anyone sorts out what actually happened, Cross is dead, Bennett is dead, the case dies with them, and I walk into the vacuum left behind, with the federal government having just watched their public enemy number 1 die in a shootout that looks entirely self-inflicted. He smiled, satisfied with the elegance of it. No one will spend much time investigating who actually fired the shots. Dead men don't need scapegoats, they just need a story, and I've built a very good one. What Salvatore did not know, could not have known, given how carefully Damien had compartmentalized the search, was that Marco's investigation into Greco's intermediary had, in the days since Olivia's discovery, finally borne fruit. A name, a pattern of meetings, a timeline that converged with growing certainty on the upcoming federal hearing as the moment Greco intended to act. He's going to move at the hearing, Marco told Damien 2 days before, spreading surveillance photos across the same desk where Olivia had found the recorder. I don't know the exact mechanism yet, but the timing's too clean to be coincidence. Greco wants you dead before this case goes any further, and he wants it to look like someone else did it. Bennett will be there too, Damien said, already understanding the shape of what was coming, with the particular cold clarity that had kept him alive for a decade. If Greco's planning something at the hearing, he's not just planning to kill me, he's planning to make it look like Bennett and I killed each other. Which means Olivia's father is walking into the same trap you are. Damien closed his eyes, and for a moment allowed himself to feel the full, terrible weight of the position he was in. A man who had spent 10 years building enemies on every side, now facing a threat that endangered not only himself, but the father of the woman he loved. A man who, by every measure of Damien's own life, should have been an enemy, and had instead, in a single act of mercy Damien hadn't expected, chosen to protect his daughter over destroying him. "We need to warn him," Damien said. "Bennett won't believe a word out of your mouth. You're the man he's spent 10 years trying to bury." "Then we don't go through me." Damien was already reaching for his phone. "We go through Olivia." She arrived at the penthouse within the hour and listened to the full shape of Greco's plan, with a face that had gone pale and still, the particular stillness of someone calculating, in real time, exactly how much danger the 2 men she loved most in the world were about to walk into. "You have to tell my father," she said. "Today, before the hearing." "He won't listen to a warning that comes from me, Olivia. He'll assume it's manipulation, a setup, one more lie from a man who spent 2 months lying to his daughter." Damien's voice was steady, but something underneath it carried real fear. Not for himself, she realized, but for her, for the impossible position he was about to put her in. You're the only person who can reach him in time, and you're going to have to do it without me in the room, because the moment he sees me, whatever trust is left between you and your father gets buried under 10 years of justified hatred. And if I can't convince him in time? Then I need a plan that doesn't depend on him believing me. Damien turned to Marco. Pull every man we have. If Bennett won't take protective measures, we provide them ourselves, whether the federal government likes it or not. I am not losing either of them to Greco's ambition, not after everything this case has already cost. Olivia drove to her father's office that afternoon, with her heart hammering against her ribs, carrying a warning from a man her father considered his life's enemy, asking him to trust a love he'd only just learned existed in order to save his own life. And she understood, walking into the federal building, that whatever happened at the hearing in 2 days' time would not just determine the fate of the case her father had spent a decade building. It would determine whether she got to keep either of them. The morning of the hearing arrived grey and overcast, the kind of Chicago sky that couldn't decide between rain and reluctant sun, and the federal courthouse steps were already crowded with reporters by the time Richard Bennett's car pulled up at the curb. Olivia stood near the security checkpoint inside, exactly where Damien's men had positioned her after 2 days of careful, anxious planning. Close enough to see, far enough to stay clear of a crossfire that everyone hoped wouldn't materialize, but no one was willing to bet a life on. Her father had listened to her warning 2 days earlier with a face carved from disbelief, then suspicion, then, slowly, reluctantly, after Agent Chen confirmed independently that surveillance had picked up unusual activity around 2 men with confirmed ties to a faction inside Cross's organization, something closer to grim acceptance. He'd doubled his protective detail. He had not, however, agreed to skip the hearing, because Richard Bennett had built his entire identity around the principle of never letting threats dictate his actions, and 10 years of pursuing Damien Cross had not softened that principle even slightly. Damien arrived 20 minutes later, flanked by Marco and 2 other men, walking into the courthouse with the same composed, dangerous stillness Olivia had first seen across a warehouse full of gunfire, except this time she understood every layer of what that stillness was actually built from. The hearing itself passed in a blur she would struggle to reconstruct later. Testimony entered into record, financial documents formally presented, the particular dry procedural language that belied the decade of blood and grief underneath it. She watched her father stand and speak with the controlled authority of a man finally closing in on something he'd chased for 10 years. She watched Damien sit at the defense table with his attorney, his face unreadable, his eyes finding hers exactly once across the courtroom, holding for a single charged second before returning to the proceedings in front of him. It was as the hearing adjourned, as the crowd began filing toward the same security checkpoint and exit corridor, that Olivia felt the first wrong note. A man near the parking structure entrance, positioned at an angle that made no sense for someone simply waiting. His hand inside his jacket in a way that triggered every instinct 2 months with Damien had sharpened in her without her fully realizing it. She moved before she'd consciously decided to. "Get down!" Her scream tore through the marble lobby, raw and absolute, cutting through the ambient noise of departing reporters and federal agents with a force that turned heads in every direction. "There's a shooter!" The first shot came almost simultaneously with her warning, and chaos detonated through the lobby,
Federal agents drawing weapons, reporters scattering, Marco moving with brutal speed to put himself between the gunman's angle and Damien, while Damien himself, instead of retreating, was already moving toward her father, who stood frozen for one fatal half-second in the open exposure of the checkpoint corridor. Olivia watched, in the strange, slowed-down clarity that trauma provides, as Damien Cross, the man her father had spent a decade trying to destroy, threw himself bodily into Richard Bennett, knocking him sideways out of the gunman's line of fire a fraction of a second before a second shot cracked through the marble lobby, the bullet burying itself in the wall exactly where her father's chest had been standing. Federal agents returned fire. The gunman, one of Greco's men, positioned exactly where Marco's intelligence had warned he might be, went down hard, and a second shooter near the parking structure exit was tackled by two of Damien's men before he managed to fire a single shot. The entire ambush collapsing in under 30 seconds into chaos, shouting, the particular ringing silence that follows violence everywhere it occurs. Olivia ran to them both, her father, shaken but unhurt, sitting up against the wall where Damien's tackle had thrown him. Damien himself, on his knees beside Richard, breathing hard, a thin line of blood at his shoulder where a stray fragment had grazed him. But alive, both of them alive, and the relief that crashed through her was so total it nearly buckled her knees. "You saved my life," Richard said, staring at Damien with an expression that contained 10 years of hatred colliding in real time with something that had no name yet. "I didn't do it for you," Damien said, his voice rough, his eyes finding Olivia's across the chaos of the lobby. "I did it because she would never have forgiven me if I hadn't, and I have already cost her enough." Reporters were already turning their cameras toward the scene, federal agents already shouting for medical attention, and Olivia stood in the middle of it, her father on one side, the man she loved on the other, her warning scream now playing back on at least 3 different news cameras for the entire city to hear and analyze and ask questions about. And understood with absolute clarity that whatever secret she had spent weeks protecting had just become irrevocably public. The story broke within hours. Federal prosecutor's daughter, dating accused crime boss, warns of assassination plot during courthouse hearing. And for 3 days, Olivia's face appeared on every local news broadcast in Chicago. The particular cruelty of public scrutiny laid bare across every channel that could spare the airtime. She bore it the way she'd learned, across 6 years of trauma medicine, to bear things that couldn't be controlled, by focusing on the next necessary task and trusting that the chaos would eventually exhaust itself. Salvatore Greco was arrested 4 days after the hearing, betrayed by his own surviving shooter, who gave a full statement in exchange for a plea deal the moment it became clear that loyalty to a failed coup carried no upside whatsoever. The financial records and testimony Greco had fed to the federal government, intended as a weapon against Damien, became, in a final irony neither man could have orchestrated, the foundation of a new case entirely: conspiracy to commit murder, attempted assassination of a federal official, racketeering charges that would put Salvatore Greco away for considerably longer than he'd ever intended for his rival. The case against Damien Cross did not disappear. Richard Bennett, true to the promise he'd made his daughter, refused to abandon a decade of pursuit simply because the man at its centre had saved his life. But he also refused, with equal stubbornness, to let Olivia's relationship become evidence against the man she loved, testifying under oath that his daughter's personal life held no bearing whatsoever on a case built from financial records and witness testimony that predated her involvement entirely. The indictment proceeded. Damien retained the best legal counsel his fortune could buy, and 6 weeks after the hearing, in a negotiation that surprised nearly everyone who'd followed the case, Damien Cross did something no one, not Marco, not Richard, not even Olivia, had genuinely believed him capable of. He cooperated. Not with everything. There were limits even his lawyers couldn't push past, loyalties to dead men he refused to betray even from the leverage of a federal indictment. But enough. Enough to dismantle what remained of Salvatore Greco's faction from the inside. Enough to provide testimony that helped federal prosecutors untangle 15 years of financial crime extending well beyond his own organization, implicating a network of corruption that reached further than even Richard had originally believed. In exchange, his own sentence, still substantial, still real, 8 years in a federal facility rather than the rest of his natural life, became something survivable, something with an end date. Why? Olivia asked him the night before he was due to report, sitting across from him in the penthouse that would no longer be his by the time he was free to return to civilian life. Every asset connected to the organization seized or surrendered as part of the deal. Because I spent 10 years telling myself the only way to survive this world was to become exactly as ruthless as the men who built it, Damien said, his hand wrapped around hers like he intended to memorize the shape of it before 8 years took the privilege away. And then I met a woman willing to scream a warning in a federal courthouse to save the life of the man who'd spent a decade hunting her own father's enemy. A woman who taught me, completely by accident, that the only way out of the life I inherited was to actually want something more than survival. He brought her hand to his lips, his eyes carrying a vulnerability she'd only ever seen in fragments before this. I want 8 years from now, Olivia. I want to walk out of that facility and find you waiting, if you're willing to wait. I have no right to ask that of you. I'm asking anyway. You don't have to ask, she said, her voice thick with everything the last 3 months had cost and given her in equal measure. I already decided. I decided the moment I screamed in that courthouse, before I even understood what it would cost me publicly. I wasn't choosing between you and my father in that moment. I was just choosing not to lose either of you. And I'm not interested in changing that decision now because the road got longer. Richard Bennett, for his part, never fully forgave Damien Cross. Some debts, he told Olivia once, with the particular honesty that had finally returned to their relationship after the hearing, are too old and too deep to be erased by a single act of saved life, however genuine. But he also never tried to keep his daughter from visiting a federal facility every month for 8 years. Never tried to talk her out of a love he didn't fully understand and had stopped, somewhere in the wreckage of the hearing, trying to destroy. He buried his brother's memory, not in another conviction, but in the slow, complicated work of letting his daughter build a life he hadn't chosen for her, and found, to his own quiet surprise, that something like peace lived on the other side of that surrender. 8 years is a long time to wait for anything. Olivia spent them building a career that outgrew the hospital that had first witnessed her fear in a curtained trauma bay. Writing letters every week to a man who wrote back in handwriting that grew steadier with each passing year. And standing on a grey Chicago morning with the lake wind cutting sharp off the water, outside a federal facility's release gate, watching a man walk toward her,
who had once carried her out of gunfire without hesitation and was now walking, just as steadily, into the first day of a life he'd chosen instead of inherited. "Dean Carter or Damien Cross?" she asked, when he finally reached her, his hand coming up to cup her face like he was confirming she was real.
"Just Damien," he said, and kissed her there at the gate, in the grey morning light, with no name left to hide behind, and nothing left to protect her from, except the ordinary, unglamorous work of building something real, which was, they would both learn in the years that followed, considerably harder than surviving a war, and immeasurably better.